Is 5v5 better for the game or is 6v6 better for the game? Now, SVB just did a phenomenal group up podcast with Samito, AVRL, Hawk, and Jake, and they talked about it at over 3 hours runtime. And I managed to sit through the entire thing, and I took notes throughout the entire session. And I've compiled these notes highlighting their major arguments, and I'm going to provide my own critiques or criticisms or things that I agree or disagree with those arguments. And then at the end, most importantly, I'm going to try and sum up both sides of the argument as best I possibly can, give my closing statements, and maybe bring in a couple of things that I don't think were mentioned as well in the actual video that I think would be good. So big shout out for SVB for hosting this podcast. I'm going to link his podcast, the podcast itself, in the description. I really, if you have the time to listen through it all the way through, I highly recommend it. This video is for those of you who don't want that don't have the time to, or really just want my thoughts on the subject. So I checked with SVB as well. I'm usually not a guy to do the whole React content thing, but I figured that this would be okay, and he said it was totally fine. So we're gonna take a look at this, especially because I want to give my own takes on this. So we're gonna start off with Samito and Hawk are on the 6v6 side. Hawk is an Overwatch League tank player for the Atlanta Reign. Samito, obviously a streamer, ex-pro player, somebody who's been playing in the scene for a long time. AVRL is a pro caster, has been in the scene for years and years and years. Jake, pro player, pro coach, pro caster, done pretty much everything here. Samito, 5v5 tank dynamic experience. And I'm going to try and timestamp these at different point in time. These are the opening statements. Samito says the 5v5 tank dynamic experience is rough. It feels the counter pick thing, support power creep is an issue. I like roll queue, but we never got a chance to show balance with the 6v6. AVRL goes with his opening statement. He says 6v6 was given no shot to balance. Nope, it was just impossible to balance with the tank rolls being the way they were in terms of synergizing and overlapping. And this is going to be AVRL's main point for the discussion. It's a lot easier to balance for casuals with 5v5. So Hawk then goes, okay, well, the game was made for 6v6. Double shield, the biggest issue whenever people talk about 6v6, was fixable. The maps were designed for 6v6. Queue times were not as fixed in 5v5. And that's something that's going to come up a couple more times. That's definitely one of the more contextual arguments that we don't really know what the queue time situation is. I feel like from anecdotal experience, the queue times are in general better in 5v5, but that just might be the game is healthier. I think we need more statistics behind the scenes. I don't think a gut instinct is really accurate because I think biases influence that gut instinct too much. So I don't think that this is an argument that we can really heavily rely off of for either side, really. He says a lot of tanking right now is about counterpicking, 5v5 matchmaking can't be fixed, too much variability. Now, I want to talk about this really quickly right now because I think this is not a great point from Hawk. I think Hawk makes a lot of great points in this argument, but I don't think this is a good point because this is just the nature of having fewer people in a lobby means that there's going to be more variability. If you have 5 coins and you flip a coin 5 times, you're more likely to get 5 heads in a row than 6 heads in a row. There's just more variability. The more coins that you have, the more likely you're going to get a 50-50 split. Right? That's just the nature of variability and probability. So when you have fewer players in a lobby, it means that there's a lot more of a chance that things can go wrong. Now, is League of Legends 4v4? I actually can't remember because you're going to notice that people talk really badly about League of Legends matchmaking and team play as well. And I don't think it's an accident that League of Legends is 4v4, I believe, which is even less than Overwatch. So if somebody has a bad game or a bad day or is just not feeling it or gets frustrated or tilted, it's a huge problem. So it's just the nature of going 6v6 to 5v5. It has really nothing to do with the tanking. And there's just as many good things about it as well. I think the ability to carry, you have more personal agency in the match, whereas a bad teammate feels heavier, but you also can be a lot stronger, if that makes any sense. So there's both good and bad things about that. I think it's just kind of a moot point, right? Jake gives his opening statement. He says, working together in 6v6s felt great, but the reality was that tank roll was still very limited. Only certain tank combos that worked. It's GG if you get Ryan Diva, Orisa Sig, and the enemy team gets it, and you get like Ryan Hogg or Orisa Zarya. 5v5 can balance for individual heroes a little bit easier. And this is going to be Jake's main thing, is that it's going to be more about the fact that there are certain combos that we always have these rose-colored glasses where like, oh, these combos were great. But he's like, what was the percentage of times where we actually got those combos? And actually it was very bad if you didn't get the combos. The spike of power and the valley of power, like how low you could get, was like super, like a Ryan Diva in Brawl versus a Ryan Hogg. It was terrible if you were the poor Ryan player with the Hogg. Like you just didn't have a lot of options. And I think that's Jake's main point. So 12 minutes in, Hawk says, support combos are just as strong as tank combos. Bap Brig, Bap Lucio, Bap Zen, Brig, Zen, all those combos are just as strong as tank. AVRL and Jank disagree. Hawk says new supports are the off-tank role. So in other words, when we talk about the support passive and some of the power creep that we see in the supports, not necessarily sustain, but through the support power, he says it's to compensate for the lack of off-tank to hold space or peel. Basically, all the supports need the ability to duel and live. And that's something that's going to come up a lot from Samito as well, where we are questioning how powerful, what is a good spike for supports in terms of power that allows them to be able to keep themselves alive support and be able to duel DPS comfortably versus what makes them oppressive and makes the DPS role feel kind of worthless. And supports are just better DPS. Samito says it's only double shield that people really, really hate. Jake says no, other combos were really bad as well. Winston, D.Va, Zarya, not a lot of counterplay for those as a supporter DPS player. It's very easy to take space. The D.Va compensating for the Winston strengths. You have to pick synergy tanks only as well, Jake says. That, like, again, if I'm playing Winston Hog, my Hog doesn't bring enough to the table to compensate for the lack of a D.Va. Hawk says you could win 1v1 versus tanks as well. So if you're a DPS or a support player, you could actually kill certain tanks in certain situations. Jake says no. AVRL says it doesn't matter because two tanks, basically it was never a 1v1 versus a tank. There's always a secondary tank or somebody else involved. So it's a moot point. So who cares? Jake's going to go on to say at 2030, current tank situations are not as bad as the tank situations in Overwatch 1. So as bad as it is right now, it could be a lot worse. Samito, basically support combos reduce the counter ability of certain tank combos. In other words, if I go Bat Brig, it's a lot harder to counter Bat Brig than it is a Bat Zen. A Bat Zen, I can dive. A Bat Brig, I can't dive while still having the spam. Now, the irony of this is that it's the same argument with Winston, where you can't counter Winston if he plays with the D.Va or if he plays with the Zarya. How many of you guys remember Ball with Zarya and two spam comps? You literally could not stop the Ball from doing whatever he wanted because he got bubbles. So the problem is that, this is my point here, it feels a little bit like he said, she said at the moment. We're talking about like, oh, this support combo is really OP, or this tank combo is really OP, therefore that role is broken. Basically, the same points are being made versus each other at the same time. Now, we're going to kind of elaborate on this argument later on in the discussion. Where is it? Brig's the problem, but Orisa's the problem. Basically, we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but stay focused on that point because we're going to be coming back to that one very soon. So AVRL says that tank synergy is the most important thing to play about in Overwatch 1. Hawk says it's the same with support. We've talked about this, right? Hawk says some tanks feel useless or limited with options. Current Overwatch 2 D.Va, current Overwatch 2 Zarya. They have aspects of the kit that haven't aged as well, whether it's their ultimate or the ability to bubble somebody else going in aggressively when if you don't have the right DPS to go in aggressively, like who do you bubble? And there's a lot of pressure, individual pressure of being a solo tank. Where you as an individual, all the pressure's on you to perform versus the enemy tank, and a lot of people don't like that. So Samito says the 6v6 role queue wasn't around long enough before Overwatch 1 went dark balance-wise, so we never really got a chance to see like what it could have been. And I think that's the main point from both Samito and Hawk is that they like Overwatch 1 better, 6v6 better for certain aspects, which we've kind of gone through and will continue to go through. And we never really know like what could have happened with proper balancing. And I think that's a fair point. Unfortunately, it's not something that we're ever really going to know. And that's a point for the 5v5. We'll talk about that one down the road. Shooting Fortified Orisa is just as bad as shooting a shield, Samito and Hawk. Samito actually dials back on this one a little bit later and says, yeah, I probably would rather shoot a Fortified Orisa than a shield, but it's still not fun. In order to keep tanks alive, they now have the survivability essentially of double tanks. Jake says you can actually avoid Orisa now. But in Overwatch 1, you couldn't avoid the tank trade near as much. In other words, when I'm playing versus double shield, it's not like I can take a flank or an angle as a DPS support. I'm going to run into the other tank. And so I eventually have to support the tank trade. There's not that option to avoid that if I don't want to. You can't make as many plays without directly contributing to the tank trade like you did in Overwatch 1. So in Overwatch 2, I actually have that flexibility to avoid that. Jake feels like it's still fun, even if not optimized tank synergy and rank. In other words, that there's more flexibility with what are bad and good compositions in Overwatch 2, whereas in Overwatch 1, even simply having a low heal composition in Overwatch 2 is a lot less of a shortcoming than it was in Overwatch 1, where if you were running Zenyatta Lucio, you can actually run that in Overwatch 2 and win many, many more circumstances than you can in Overwatch 1. Samito says that tanks were killable. It's worse to be shooting a tank now. So while it's a lot easier to avoid the Orisa, if you do run into the Orisa in current situation, it's a lot harder to kill the Orisa than it is in Overwatch 2. And I think this is a good point. So if you can avoid the tank trade, Overwatch 2 is better. If you can't avoid the tank trade, then Overwatch 1 might be better because the tanks in Overwatch 2 aren't really near as killable. Jake says tank synergies were more frustrating in Overwatch, or lack of tank synergies. Hawk says a lot of things about a tank that a tank can't do or can't deal with. Jake says it's a game problem of helplessness, not 5v5 or 66. Sam says it forces DPS to take more responsibility to counter now. And I think that's, again, a very fair point, but there isn't really to me, this is like perfectly like split down the middle. It's like, yes, there's more situations that you have to directly fix yourself, but this is my point here. It's a balance of individual responsibility. You having to be responsible for doing things as a tank or as a DPS, whether it's countering the enemy Widow or dealing with the enemy Sombra or dealing with the enemy Orisa. I mean, there's one fewer body to deal with that. One fewer tank to deal with that. So that's just the balance of individual responsibility. It's a double-edged sword. It's both a good and a bad thing. And I don't really think that we can objectively say which variation is better. Jake says the game is balanced because counter picking is viable. I couldn't quite understand his point here. Is like the fact that you can counter pick, it means the game is relatively balanced. You can't just play on one character. I think it makes sense, but it didn't have as much relevance in the discussion. He says more comp variety. Hawk says that not that much variety. More of a balance issue. Also, you can feel helpless more often in a 5v5. AVRL says that tank was a huge issue in 6v6 as well. People complained about tank arguably even more in Overwatch 1. The tanking in Overwatch 1 felt just as bad, if not worse, than Overwatch 2. He says that we have a bit of a recency bias where everyone's talking about Sleep Dart and Discord and Hack, yes, but those things were also in Overwatch 1. And while there was one more warm body to take that heat away from us, people still didn't play tank in Overwatch 1. So clearly it was bad enough to justify us questioning whether it was actually better. Hawk says 5v5 is way more chaotic, less predictable because people have bad days. We talked about this. Having 5 people instead of 6 people means that there's a lot more variance in your matchmaking. Jake says hero design of dynamics because of 5v5 has helped so that there's less. If you go in with the Symmetra OTP in Overwatch 1, you're screwed if you're on the wrong map or the wrong comp. In Symmetra Overwatch 2, with Symmetra, there's a lot more variety. Now, my point on that is I agree with Jake. This is something I've been talking about a lot recently. However, I don't think that's necessarily something that they could not have done with 2 tanks, to be perfectly fair. I think that, giving Symmetra more dynamics is something that we immediately tie to Overwatch 2 5v5, but there's nothing inherent about 5v5 that demands that, if that makes any sense. Like, they could have left Symmetra exactly as she is, and she would have been a lot less effective because there's one fewer tank to shoot. So I think it kind of gives the devs a kick in the pants, but they could have done that with 66 as well. Samito says support strength is really hurting the DPS role right now. And I think that's a fair point. That's something that's going to come up again a little bit later, so stay tuned. AVRL says lack of tank desire has always been a problem in 6v6. Queue time with support may result with new supports and content. So tank has always been a problem. People don't want to play tank. And we're going to talk more about why that might be. Jake has some good guesses as to that a little bit later. Hawk says lots of tank designs age really poorly in 5v5. Super broken, super bad. Supports are much better generalists than tanks. Fewer weaknesses. In other words, support rework, support changes have much more encouraged supports to be a lot more dynamic in terms of just heal botting or in terms of doing 1 or 2 things. They have a lot more dynamics. They feel like the tanks have not caught up with that dynamics as much, which I agree with and is one of the biggest points about what is our solution if we're going to be sticking with 5v5. AVRL agrees for balance perspective. We can bounce for that. Hawk says that these reworks are going to take forever, though. And this is my point, though, is like, who cares if they're going to take forever? I mean, I care, but it's not like 6v6 is going to be any closer of a change, because if we go back to 6v6, we're still going to need reworks, right? So I think this is kind of a moot point from Hawk, where he's being generally disagreeable about 5v5, because his critiques of this 5v5 thing with the reworks, it applies to 6v6 just as much, if not even more so. So what's the point, right? We have to make the best that where we're at right now. Jake says Junker Queen, the design of Junker Queen, a really fun character, could never existed because tank combos made stuff like that super busted potentially when supported or supporting somebody else. Something with speed, shout. The dynamics of tank in Overwatch 2 are possible because you don't have to be as limited with Overwatch 1 because you're scared of, oh no, what could Junker Queen do with a Rhine? Or what could Junker Queen do with a Zarya bubble? We don't have to ask those questions because it's no longer a problem. And you notice that a lot of the discussion goes around the off-tank ability to support a different tank. Not just off-tank. I think the idea of a shield being stackable with somebody else's defensive utility is really important, but basically stacking defensive or enabling utility is like a big theme here. Hawk thinks D.Va and Ball cannot be fixed fundamentally. That was one I don't necessarily agree with, but it is a good point that there are aspects of the character that just don't feel super good in Overwatch 2, like the peel mindset of a diva with Matrix. Like Matrix is used a lot more offensively now, but it doesn't feel as good of an ability for that. Ball, right? Solo isolation, big AoE slams, things that you don't get as much in Overwatch 2, or if you do, it's super broken. So how do you balance those things? And I do think that like if you are a 5v5 advocate, I'm going to be honest, I do think 5v5 is just reasonably the way to go. Not because I think 5v5 is necessarily inherently better, just because I think it's stupid to think that 6v6 is ever going to be coming back. Like, let's be honest here, guys. So we need to take what we were given and make the best of it. But I do think that we need to be thinking really creatively about like what needs to change with Diva and Bald, and like how do we adjust these heroes to actually match the Overwatch 2 dynamic a lot better. AVRL thinks the gap between optimal tank and suboptimal tank, biggest issue with Overwatch 1. We talked about this. Zarya, Hawk. How on earth do you win with Hawk? And you guys can come up with answers potentially, but I can tell you from like a Diamond Masters GM Plus lobbies, maybe things are differently in lower ranks, but it's almost impossible to make that work. And that's a pretty large percentage of the player base, even though it is in the higher player base, that was just not able to make that function. And that's the problem. And that's something that Jake talks about as well, is that like you have certain tank combos that worked really, really well together, potentially broken. And then you had combos that were so bad that it was not even worth doing. And that's just not something that any other role, at least to the extent tank has to deal with. And that's the problem, is that level of variance led to a really bad game experience. Not to mention a balancing nightmare. Jang thinks picking Hog feels almost more winnable now than a suboptimal tank synergy matchup in Overwatch 1. Interesting. Samito thinks the average tank experience right now is actually worse, but he says more anecdotal. He says tank trading is more common, but the ability to cover weaknesses in Overwatch 1, it was what allowed things to go a little bit better. AVRL says that there was no covering of weaknesses in Overwatch 1 if your optimal tank situation was not there. So in other words, it doesn't matter. You didn't have your weaknesses covered as a Reinhardt if you didn't have a Zarya or a Diva, or even a Sigma, right? Like you didn't. It's not like, oh, you're covering my weaknesses. That there was no covering of weaknesses. AVRL and Jake think support power needs and can be scaled back. Samito Hawk are a little bit more skeptical that they can actually find that pendulum balance. So Jake says support queues may also be because how fun, like long support queues may not just because support's broken, because how fun support is right now with the new hero designs, with Iliari, with Kiriko, with Lifeweaver's rework actually making him a little bit more, not rework, but his buffs making him a little bit more enjoyable. Support's a pretty fun role right now. And I think that's something that's hard to argue with, but it's hard to say that that's a problem so much as that other roles or other heroes may need to be caught up to speed. We're also coming off of 3 support characters, not back to back, but 3 out of 5 of the last characters. If I'm doing my math right, I think Ramatra, Ramatra, actually 3 out of the last 4 maybe. I'm totally forgetting here, but have been supports. So Hawk thinks current Ramarissa is more boring than anything in Overwatch 1 besides double shield. Samito thinks dynamics is really missing in the Overwatch 2 tank. Jake says Overwatch 1 couldn't have fixed the anti-synergy tanks like Hog, Zarya, would have required rework tanks that don't have the synergy support combos. And Samito says 1 tank for 11 tanks is tough to balance. So in other words, some different thoughts in there. One of the things that Samito brings up is that it's harder to balance. He thinks it's harder to balance when you play only 1 tank, but you can pick 11 different tanks. So I think it's kind of hard to like really judge whether that's the case or not, but it's an interesting point. Hawk says, imagine if we went solo support. Imagine if we removed a support role. How broken would we need to make Lucio to compensate for the solo support role? I think that's an interesting point as well. AVRL says tank isn't unique. And this, by the way, this goes back to his point that like current solo tanks are like super, super tanky, like super, super hard to kill to compensate. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that point because I think tanks already started from a standpoint of being survivable to an extent. And so we just had to kind of toy with that, but it is an interesting point. AVRL says tank is unique in that stacking feels exponentially powerful. For DPS, for supports, not as potent. For tanks, though, crazy. Obviously, think about roll queue was created because of that. And if you ignore Goats and Briggs and Mercy, there has never really been a more than 2 support meta. Both of those were enabled by Brig. Now, beyond that, in terms of tank stacking, if we ignore Goats, tank stacking has been a very, very popular strategy. 3 tanks, 4 tanks. Even quad tank before Overwatch League was even a thing was a very powerful composition that leveraged the survivability and beef essentially that tanks provide, and the synergy of having something that can have both bubble and a matrix and a shield. It's a fundamental map control issue, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's an inherent problem of beef and tank synergies around. Right. Okay. I mean, even think about like Overwatch 2 with like open queue, right? People were playing tanks. Now, obviously, tanks were really, really strong, but then they had to not only nerf tanks in open queue, but they actually had to nerf tanks to points to where they were even weaker than they were in Overwatch 1. Now, you could be like, well, duh, because Overwatch 2 tanks are super buffed. Well, yes, but they didn't just scale them back to Overwatch 1 standards. They scaled them back to even below Overwatch 1 standards, because even in the 5v5 format, the ability to have a 500 HP Reinhardt or a 400 HP Zarya probably would have been just a little bit too potent. Jake says the idea of a protection tank like Enabler, Diva, Zarya, Reinhardt just wasn't that popular for the majority of players. A niche population that really likes it, but most of the players aren't really interested in it. So people want to do stuff themselves. Tank in general is not a popular role for any game, MMO, first-person shooter, whatever. 5v5 made a change that better reflects the average player base, and I think that this is probably one of the best arguments for 5v5. You can talk about how we could have reworked tanks and made them more fun and dealt with the synergies and double shield, but ultimately tank just would not have been as popular as a role. I don't think there's anything that would have changed that without completely shifting how the role functions. You need to not notice that Overwatch 2 didn't just cut down on a tank, but they made the tank more like a DPS and how it functions for most of the characters. And I think that's sadly something that is just speaks more to the average player. Now, there will be a certain niche population that doesn't enjoy that. I think the Mercy community is a phenomenal example that is very antagonistic towards anything that resembles offensive pressure for Mercy. However, most people don't play Mercy because of the lack of offensive pressure. That's why people don't play Mercy. So if we only focus on, oh, Mercy is a good hero because a lot of people like her, well, yes and no. And I think that's a really good point for Jake, especially when we're talking about an entire role. An entire role is not going to be popular for a certain subset of people because if I'm not playing Roadhog, I'm not really providing offensive pressure. And I think that's one of the biggest arguments for the Overwatch 2 design. Samito thinks tank content around SIG did make people want to play. Removing the off tank, but it cuts both ways, right? So people did want to play when SIG came out, which is, hit here and there. But he says that like just as, by removing an off tank, you're talking about like, okay, people don't want to play it, but you also just removed an entire role. That's going to be discouraging players too. So ultimately, we really don't know. He thinks the cost outweighs the reward, and I would disagree, but I do think that he makes a really good point. AVRL says the problem is a requirement to synergize tanks in 66. We talked about this. The archaic tank design is being fixed, hopefully, as we say right now. The strength of counterpicking, the fact that something like a wrecking ball doesn't feel as good in Overwatch 2. But right now, things are being moved slowly in the right direction. New characters have dynamics. I think if nothing else besides Lifeweaver and to an extent Ramattra, all of the Overwatch 2 heroes are a lot more dynamic and very fun to play. The meta is a lot more flexible, even in the pro levels, than it's ever been in any point in time in Overwatch 1. Counterpicking tank as a 5v5 is a result of design or balance, not necessarily 5v5. Sam and Hawk disagree with that. We're just never going to get those tank synergy playstyles back. And I think like that's a tough one to argue with. We just really don't know. So Jake says the bubble playstyle for Zarya is there in Overwatch 2, enabling somebody else, just like you did Overwatch 1. Hawk says yes, but you can't bubble a tank. And Jake says, who are you going to bubble? A Roadhog or an Orisa? That's ultimately who you're playing with the majority of the time, especially in mid to lower ranks. And I think that's, again, good points from both sides, because yes, the bubble the tank might be something that you might have enjoyed. That's not really going to come back. It's going to be more about you bubbling yourself or a selective DPS if you get them. And maybe that's a flaw in Zarya's current design, right? But it's also fair to say that the bubbling tank was something that if you stacked with friends or if you had somebody that you work with, it could work. But that's most of the time that wasn't the case. AVRL says listing things we lost with OpenQ in 66 is endless and pointless because that is a two-edged sword. We can talk about things that we gained with 5v5. It's a bad faith argument. Sam says loss of flexibility with tank option is too great. Jake says this argument is meaningless, slippery slope. We don't really know. Hawk says tank is too tanky. Tank war is a lot less fun than it was in Overwatch 2. It feels less meaningful because you can get an advantage, but you can't actually kill the target when you get an advantage. If you misuse a bubble in Overwatch 1, maybe the Rhine dies. If you misuse a bubble in Overwatch 2, it's harder to kill that Zarya, which I think is fair, but I think that's more of like the dopamine thing where you still get value, you just don't always kill the target, if that makes any sense. General complaints about being able to carry. Jake says it's a new problem from you, just being one of the best in the world. SVB chimes in, and I really appreciate this from SVB. He chimes in, he says, maybe because the counterwatch is easier, because it's easier for the worst tank to counter you in the tank mirror. In other words, if I'm the plat player in a diamond lobby and the enemy team is going, Doomfist, maybe if I go Orisa, it's easier for me to provide more value than I should just by playing the counter watch game. But SVP says this also happens in 6v6 if the Ryan doesn't cooperate with what I want to do. In other words, if I need to carry the lobby as a diamond player in a plat lobby and I go Ryan, my off tank goes Hog, well, now I can't carry anymore. Right, it's a lot harder to carry. So it's really tricky to go both ways. And I think, again, this comes down to a hero design issue, not necessarily something that's inherent to 5v5 or 6v6. Why is Orisa allowed to get as much value as she does with as little effort? That's the problem with Orisa, not necessarily 5v5. AVRL says the average player wants value easier. Hawk says counterpicking is easier for lower ranks. Jake says it's easier to deal with outliers and synergies in 5v5. Some just etc. thoughts. Sam says it's pointless to cry over more carry potential, but there's just more variance in 5v5. It happens. We talked about this. It's just the nature of 5v5. But a DPS feels like a lot less carry in Overwatch 2 because you can't kill the tanks like you could in Overwatch 1. Supports are also tougher to kill. Thinks that this can maybe be balanced in 5v5. Hawk says focusing on heroes who haven't aged well is really, really, really important. He just really seems hung up on the fact that the game was not supported back in 6v6 transition and seems bitter and frustrated at that. And I think that's really fair. So here's the crux of the issue. Is it easier to balance supports or two tanks working together? That's the question that you really have to ask yourself if you're trying to find which side of the argument that you're really going for. Jake, 5v5 support combos were not as big of a deal as tank combos, not as many bad support combos as tank combos. In other words, outside of a few really, really bad combos like, a Lucio Mercy. And even that actually has some situations when it's doable. There are fewer really bad or really OP support combos there when we compare to the tank combos of Overwatch 1, which I think is a fair point. Tank is a lot more reliant on combos than support. Sam says the role passive enables supports to be less reliant on the combos because of on their duo. Jake says no, the passive is not that crucial for the support synergy situation. I think it could go either way. I think something like the support passive does help some supports function a little bit better without needing as much help, but I do see the point to both sides. Sam says supports definitely did rely on each other. AVRL says it's not about supports relying on each other. It's about, are there wildly OP combos? Whether we rely on each other or not, was there something abusable about a Moira Lucio that is like, oh no, they got a Moira Lucio. Oh crap, man, we're going to lose this game, right? While the pendulum swings too bad to good, there's a lot more with tank and support. So in other words, when we have a really bad tank combo or a really good tank combo, there's a lot more variance than there is with the support situation in terms of, they have an OP support combo or they don't have an OP support combo. Tanks are either broken or nobody wants to play it. It requires optimization. Sam says, yeah, but it wasn't that much hated outside of double shields. That's what made tank fun. Jake 6v6 says tank synergy limits new hero designs because there's too much of a fear of, okay, what if we give this character, would Junker Queen would have been released with the fear of the fact of what could they do with a shout and a speed tank with a bubble? Like we said, it's a limited hero design because we didn't want to give a utility to a tank that could be abused in a combo. Hawk is, you think devs couldn't have done it? I do. But then I really want to point out that there's an irony here between both of these where we think that like Jake says that they don't think that they can do it. Hawk thinks that they could, but really both sides are second guessing the developer's competence in some way, shape, or form. Hawk has just got done thinking that developers incompetent of putting up quality reworks at all or balancing the game properly or the support at all. But then he does think that the devs could have come up with new heroes. And I guess you could say the opposite is true on the opposite side. So I think there's a little bit of hypocrisy to a little bit extent here from both sides. But I think I see Jake's point, I see Hawk's point, but draw your own conclusions. AVRL concludes what led to a better design of the game that's easier for the devs is 5v5. Game is really hard to balance. So how are good players and bad players going to be balanced around? It's difficult. I think tank was a specific issue in Overwatch 1 more than any other role because of the synergies. Doing the thing that we have now reduces the optimization extremes where you have a really OP combo or a really bad combo. There's a little bit more of a balance between there. Or outside of your team picks a Roadhog, there aren't many situations where you're like, oh no, we picked a Zarya, GG's, we lose. If you think that, that's probably more of a you problem than a game problem. Hawk concludes, We want to balance 6v6. I just want to balance 6v6. I would have liked to have seen a 6v6 in a balanced format. I don't know if things are going to get better. Jake concludes, reality is that people did not want to play tank. People don't like playing tank role. This is necessary. Overall, Q times between roles are better than Overwatch 1. Again, we don't really know if that's the case. It's an anecdote. I think it's probably true, but we don't really know. So we don't know stats. We can't really say. It fits the better player population. People are more interested in personal responsibility. Triple support, not nearly as good as triple tank, not as much as abused. We talked about this already. 3 DPS, also something that was rarely abused. So basically the point being is that tank is, he's trying to echo AVRL's point that tank is an inherently broken role through its survivability, through its utility, that always led to synergies and combos mattering more for tank than DPS or support. What happens if my entire team is matrixed or shielded or bubble? Discussion on map control objective. We'll talk about that in a second. I don't think fun Overwatch 2 heroes like Kiriko could have functioned in that environment. So this is the big thing with GOATs. GOATs basically existed, if you guys don't know what GOATs are, Ryan, Zarya, Diva, Brig, Lucio, Zen. It started with Moira. At the time, it basically just turtle on point. Don't take any map control. Don't take any angles. Just group up, heal, survive, and push cart. And it just was able to survive any sort of pressure from as many map control and different angles. And if you're familiar with first-person shooters, angles, map control, crossfire, sightlines, things like that are very, very important fundamentals of first-person shooters. And basically what Overwatch 2 did is, through the power of tanks and to an extent supports as well, Brigitte was an awesome, terrible support. They were allowed to cheat the game and just ignore map control. And so Jake's argument is that while support being broken was a problem with that as well, I think that tank has more consistently been able to cheat the system through the ability to ignore map control and just group up and huddle up on point. Because the more people are grouped up, the more value my shield gets. The more people are grouped up, the more value my matrix gets. And I actually think this is a fair point with something that was not brought up. This is a very important point in the fact that there have been not just double shield, but several other metas where the ability to do this has functioned because of two tanks. Rein Diva, there were several metas where Rein Diva was able to go to point and turtle on point. Not as strong as GOATs, but not as strong as double shield, but was something that was still able to be done. Something that was more enabled by the tank line than the support line. Winston Diva, Moira Lucio. Again, Moira Lucio brought a lot to the table there, but the fact that you needed Diva Matrix was the big thing. The fact that was actually possible was more to do with the tanks than it was to do with the supports. And I think that's a really, really important point. We never ever want to go away from the point where the survivability of the tank combo is what allows them to cheat the game. Sam says, I wish 6v6 rule Q, again, like Hawk, got a chance. Always a what could have happened with the developer attention. 5v5 is still good. It just created an own set of unique problems and emphasized other problems that were already in the game, just made them worse. I think mostly talking about supports. I think 6v6 was better overall, a lower floor, higher skill ceiling. I think he's talking specifically about the ability to combo certain tanks, which just added an extra layer of complexity that isn't there. Obviously, everyone in here this was a pretty heated debate. I think there was a lot of interrupting. I think people could have done a little bit more patient to actually let people finish their thoughts. It also seemed like a little bit like outside of Samito, I don't know. It's not really fair to say, but it did feel like a little, at times, people were more ready to jump and just disagree and tell you why you were wrong instead of trying to see things from your perspective. So it was a productive debate if you were listening to it, but I don't think it's going to change anybody's minds. It changed my mind about a couple of things. It definitely shifted my perspective of what are some things that we need to be looking out for. I'll talk about those in a second. But everyone's good friends. Chat apparently was really, really bad. A lot of people got banned for just being super insulting and like just generally turtly. So that's unfortunate. I think a lot of people get really emotionally attached to this, which is kind of funny to me. Okay, so main takeaways. Let's try and sum this up as best I can. 66 advocates. It was enjoyable, high skill ceiling tank synergies. 5v5 has indirectly led to DPS feeling less useful through tanks being hard to kill and support creep. Double shield was the most hated tank synergy specifically, but other stuff wasn't quite as bad. 6v6, my cat's going crazy. 6v6 never got the chance to bounce because Overwatch 1 died when 6v6 role queue came out not much long afterwards. That was when Overwatch 2 development started. Too many fossil characters now that were 5v5 heroes that just don't fit in the current meta. Ball, Diva, things like that. The unkillable solo tank is just as enjoyable as double tank. More variables for quality game with one fewer player, so there's more unpredictability. She's going crazy. There's more unpredictability, so it makes things a lot more harder. And the counterpick meta is still an issue. So while counterpicking has always kind of been a problem, people are arguing that it's more of a counterpick issue because when we have one fewer tank to compensate for the strengths and weaknesses, again, whether that actually happened in most games, it's a lot easier to counterpick. So 5v5 advocates. Tank synergy was an unfixable variable with a utility provided to cover weakness, either huge strength or huge weakness. So it was either, again, tank synergy was super strong or super weak, too much variability, too easy to be abused, cheating the game, or just an awful experience if you're playing Zarya Hog. There's more dynamic with character design through 5v5, which is overall positive. As I said, that's not necessarily unique to 5v5 potentially, but I think it's something that it was the kick in the pants for devs to actually do it, because a Symmetra with only one tank is not going to function as a tank buster or burning off of a shield only. She has to actually find a way to make the character work beyond that. If I'm playing an Ana and I don't have a tank passive or a support passive, then I'm going to die to dive so frequently because I don't have an off tank. So I think that's it was kind of the kick in the pants to make a couple of quality of life changes. Okay, more individual carry potential in 5v5, more dynamics in teamfight besides this is tank trait first. We talked about that. Tank combos besides double shield were also difficult to play into. Winston Zarya is a great one where the Winston jumps in with bubble and he has no weaknesses. It is almost impossible to counterplay. You can't sleep him, you can't CC him, you can't boop him, you can't avoid him. He's going to come, and I think that's something that obviously people will have mixed memories of, but it's an issue. Support issue can be balanced and more reasonable to balance. It's more reasonable to balance this than it is to completely revamp the game and go back to 6v6. The protector mindset or enabler of oh man, I miss playing Ryan with a Zarya, or man, I miss peeling for my team as a diva, is just a niche desire that most people don't miss that. The vocal minority who liked that are going to complain, but that's always going to be the case with any change that you make. My personal points, I'll add 2 points for favor of 5v5. And they're super simple. One, it was less visual clutter. That's pretty much just how it is. There's objectively less visual clutter. I mean, people can still whip out, oh, look at this Yari ult and a sim wall and, all. Obviously, there's still visual clutter in 5v5, but it's objectively less visual clutter because there's too fewer players. It's not that hard. And also, 5v5 is the big one. This is just where it's at. It's going to be 5v5. So I think these debates are fun to discuss things, and I think they're fun to discuss because it raises problems with our current format so that we can fix our current format. So we're 5v5. It's not changing, guys. Get over it. But we should take these debates as we look at this list here, right? All these problems, we got to address some of these problems, right? Can we not fix some of these problems? And I think that's where our priority should be. These debates are productive because they bring issues up with 5v5, which is where we're going right now. So we need to be dealing with those issues. And that's why I think these debates are really important. So my points are 5v5, but also my problems with 5v5. Definitely directly interact with the worst of the enemy team without a second meat shield, need to address this. So in other words, if I'm playing Reinhardt Hog, my Hog, it's a terrible combo, but my Hog will get Sleep Dart, most likely than not, and I won't have to worry as much about Sleep Dart. Or, maybe the Sombra will go for my Hog instead of me. There's just fewer things that I'm going to have to deal with directly myself because they're going to be spread more evenly, especially on the big fat guy in the flank, right? So the problem with tank right now is that because you are the solo tank, you are going to be interacting with the worst of the enemy team. And it's not an accident that besides something like a Roadhog hook, if I'm playing Reinhardt, I don't care about the enemy Diva's Matrix. I don't care about the enemy Zarya Bubble. I don't care about Sigma Shield. There's maybe Rock or something. But a lot of the things that people I'm complaining about as a tank are not the enemy tank's things, but actually the enemy supports and DPS. So when we remove a tank, I'm going to have to deal with more things. I'm not thinking about, I don't have to deal with the enemy Sigma, Rock, and Hook. I'm thinking more about the fact that now I individually have to deal with both Discord and Sleep Dart and Hack by myself. And I think that's something that we have to look at either with the tank passive or the individual identity of those abilities in themselves. I do think that, like Hawk was saying, fossils have to be addressed. The ease of counterpicking, flaw of design. So in other words, Ball, Diva, how do we deal with these designs? How easy is it to pick Orisa and counterpick something like a Doomfist? Is that too easy? And I think there are some character changes and character designs. I've talked a lot about this at length in some of my other videos that need to be changed going into the 5v5 format because they are exacerbated just a little bit when you remove that extra variable. And the last thing is just, again, the support creep, lack of DPS impact. This is going to be something that's going to be taking a lot of tweaking. I think you can go too far in either direction. As they were saying earlier, it's a pendulum effect. So a lot of people complaining early in Overwatch 2's release, and then now a lot of people complaining that it's too strong. I think it's not just the support power creep, though. I also think that people's mentalities have shifted with support, and that people have gotten better, even though the support role necessarily hasn't been super giga buffed. So I think that people have gotten better at the role while it's also been minorly buffed at the same time. So anyway, that's going to about do it up for me. Obviously a ton to talk about, but I think that if we need to understand this discussion if we want to fix the issues of the game that we're currently in. A big shout out to SVB, to Samito, to AVRL, to Jake, to Hawk for providing such a productive and interesting discussion. If you have any questions, any comments, please let me know in the chat, and I'll chat with you guys later.